I don't think you'd still be here, Chiamaka.
This is my farm, Obinno. Where else would I be?
I heard you were hiring seasonal workers.
I never expected it would be you.
16 years ago, your mother told everyone that poor blood didn't belong in a rich family.
I'm curious now that you're standing here asking for a job. What would she call it now?
The morning held that particular stillness that settles over farmland just after sunrise, before the day's labor properly begins. Somewhere behind them, rows of cocoa trees stretched toward a hill. Neither of them could see the end of from where they stood. 16 years earlier, in a wedding hall in Akure that most of the groom's own family had refused to attend, a farmer's daughter married into a name far larger than her own and very nearly disappeared underneath it. Chiamaka Okere grew up in a 2-room house outside Akure with a roof that let the rain in every September, the daughter of a cocoa farmer whose land had been failing for as long as she could remember. She met Obinna Adesanya at a cousin's wedding, a visitor from Lagos with a careful smile and a quietness around her that he could not quite name, and for 6 months that quietness felt, to both of them, like the beginning of something neither family could talk them out of. His mother tried anyway. Chief Mrs. Folashade Adesanya did not raise her voice when her son told her who he intended to marry. She set down her cup of tea very slowly, asked him to repeat the village's name, as though hearing it twice might somehow change what it meant, and told him only that she hoped he understood exactly what he was choosing to throw away. She did not attend the reception. She sat through the church portion in grey, the one color in the entire hall that matched nothing, and left before the first dance, and everyone who noticed understood exactly what the silence of her empty chair was meant to say. The cruelty inside the Lagos compound did not arrive as shouting. It arrived the way water finds a crack, slowly, finding every weak place and settling there until the structure itself begins to give. Within the first month, Chiamaka noticed that the housegirls had stopped using her name entirely, addressing her instead, gently and with no apparent malice, only as the farmer's daughter, a habit that had clearly been set in motion somewhere above their own heads and simply trickled down to them. She corrected no one. Correcting people, she learned quickly in that house, only gave them a reason to repeat the thing twice, louder. Within the second month, she fell seriously ill with malaria, the fever high enough that she could barely stand, and asked, through the housegirl, whether someone might call a doctor to the house since Obinna was traveling. Chief Mrs. Adesanya sent back word that village girls were known to recover from fever on their own without troubling a real doctor, and that the household chemist shop down the road sold tablets perfectly adequate for that sort of thing. Chiamaka lay in bed for 4 days with a wet cloth on her own forehead, changing it herself between bouts of shaking, while the house carried on its ordinary business around her as though nothing in it had changed at all. Within the 4th month, her own parents traveled the long distance from Akure to visit, dressed in their best clothes, carrying yams and a bag of garden eggs as a gift for the household. Chief Mrs. Adesanya received them in the front parlor for exactly 11 minutes, offered no food despite the elaborate spread already laid out for a separate guest arriving later that afternoon, and remarked, as they were leaving, that she hoped the journey back would not be too difficult for people not used to traveling such distances. Chiamaka walked her parents to the gate herself, apologizing with her eyes for what she could not say with her mouth, and watched her father's shoulders carry the visit home the entire 4 hours back to Akure. There was an evening, during her sister-in-law's 18th birthday, that Chiamaka would carry for the rest of her life, the way a body carries an old break, healed over, but still aching before rain. Nearly 60 guests stood beneath white canopies in the garden, the air thick with perfume and roasted meat, the band still warming up. Chief Mrs. Adesanya moved through the crowd, collecting compliments the way some women collect jewelry, and when she reached the dessert table, she stopped, turned, and raised her voice just enough for the nearest 20 guests to hear clearly. She hoped, she said, smiling the whole time, that the kitchen had kept something simpler aside, in case any guest's stomach was more accustomed to the kind of food eaten in smaller, poorer places than the kind being served tonight. Her eyes found Chiamaka's across the garden as she said it, and held there for exactly as long as it took the laughter to finish traveling around the table. Chiamaka did not move for several seconds. She felt the heat climb up her neck first, then her face, then settle somewhere behind her eyes where she refused, in front of 60 people, to let it become anything visible. She picked up a plate she did not want, walked to the far edge of the garden, and stood near the fence pretending to admire flowers she could not have named if asked, until the burning in her chest finally became something she could swallow without her hands shaking. Obinna found her there 20 minutes later. He did not ask what was wrong. He had heard the comment too, from across the garden, and the fact that he came to stand beside her without once mentioning it told her everything about exactly how much defending she should expect from him going forward. In the 3rd year, Chiamaka lost the pregnancy. In her 5th month, on a Tuesday afternoon, alone in the house, while Obinna was in a meeting. He did not leave early, for once a housegirl finally reached him. By the time he arrived at the hospital, it was already over. He stood at the foot of her bed for a long time without speaking, and Chiamaka watched him search for something to say and fail to find it, and understood, lying there with her body still aching from a loss neither of them had words for yet, that she would be grieving this mostly by herself. 3 nights later, unable to sleep, she walked down toward the kitchen for water and stopped outside the study door at the sound of her own name, Chief Mrs. Adesanya's voice came through low and certain, the voice of a woman delivering a verdict rather than a comfort. She told her son that the loss was a sign, that a marriage which had never carried the family's blessing could hardly be expected to carry an heir either, that a woman without the right blood behind her could not be expected to give the Adesanya name a child worth the name itself. Then, almost in the same breath, she reminded him of a loan the company badly needed from an old associate whose unmarried daughter had once been exactly the match she had hoped for him before all of this. Chiamaka stood in the dark hallway with one hand against the cold wall, listening to her own husband say nothing in her defense, the silence on the other side of that door lasting long enough that she had her answer before she ever returned to bed. She did not confront him about it the next morning, or the morning after that. She watched, instead, the way a person watches whether they cannot stop, as the household allowance grew thinner each month, as invitations to family events stopped including her name, as Obinna's explanations for her growing absences became shorter and less interested in sounding convincing. The end came on an ordinary Wednesday. She returned from the market with a basket of tomatoes still warm from the sun, pressed the gate's code into the keypad out of habit, and watched it flash red twice. She stood there in the heat for several minutes before the gateman, unable to meet her eyes, finally came to the smaller side door, carrying her 2 suitcases already packed and a folded note in Obinna's handwriting that she did not open until she was sitting on the curb outside a house she had believed, until exactly that moment, was half hers. The note was short. It used the word space. It used the word think. It did not use her name once. He did not call for nearly 2 months. When he finally did, it was only to ask whether she had received the divorce papers his mother's lawyer had already prepared, and whether she intended to sign them quietly or make things difficult for everyone. The bus ride back to Akure was the longest 4 hours of Chiamaka's life, not because of the distance, but because of how thoroughly she understood. somewhere outside Ore, that she was returning with considerably less than she had left with 8 years earlier. She had left a poor man's daughter with a future still ahead of her. She was coming back a discarded wife with 2 suitcases and a story the entire village would finish telling before she ever opened her mouth to explain it herself. Her own village did not spare her either. Within days, the market women had assembled their own version of events, the kind built more from satisfaction than fact, and word traveled from one stall to the next with the particular speed reserved for a story people had been quietly waiting years to tell. A woman she had grown up beside, 2 stalls down from her mother's old fabric table, made no effort to lower her voice as Chiamaka passed one morning, remarking to a neighbor that some people leave the village chasing big houses and big names and come back with nothing but big suitcases, and that pride, in the end, always finds its way back down to size. The neighbor laughed, not unkindly exactly, the way people laugh at something they have already decided is simply true. Even at her father's own church, where she had been christened as an infant, an usher, who had once carried her school bag home for her as a girl, now greeted her with a politeness so careful it amounted to its own kind of insult, the tone reserved for people the congregation had quietly downgraded. Children in the compound, repeating words they had clearly heard from somewhere else, called after her on her way to the borehole one morning, asking whether it was true that a rich man's family had thrown her out like spoiled meat. She did not turn around. She filled her bucket, balanced it on her head, exactly the way her mother had taught her at 9 years old, and walked home with her back straight, refusing to let the children behind her see anything in her shoulders worth repeating to their own mothers later that evening. Her father never once joined the gossip, but even his silence in those first weeks carried its own particular weight. The silence of a man watching a daughter he had once been proud to walk to her own wedding, now sitting at his table with nowhere else in the world left to go. The farm itself, 6 hectares her grandfather had planted decades earlier, had been declining steadily under her father's tired hands, weakened by old age, poor soil, and a complete absence of the capital needed to properly rehabilitate it. Chiamaka walked the rows with him one quiet morning, looking at trees that had given his entire working life and were now barely producing enough to justify harvesting them, and made herself a promise she did not say aloud, the way she had learned, across 8 years in a house that never wanted her, to keep the things that mattered most entirely to herself. The same patience that house had forced her to practice for 8 years turned out to be exactly the discipline this tired, half-forgotten land had been waiting for. A government extension officer named Mazi Hyacinth Eze taught her, within months, what 8 years in a wealthy man's house never had: how to read soil instead of judgment, how patience produced results instead of permission. She reinvested every naira instead of spending it, and within 2 years, the rehabilitated rows were yielding more than her father had managed in 2 decades. By her 4th year, an international buyer touring the region tasted beans from her plot specifically and offered her the cooperative's first direct export contract, cutting out the middlemen who had underpaid every farmer in the region for as long as anyone could remember. 6 years after that, her network reached nearly 40 smallholder farmers across 3 villages, a processing facility carried her name, and international buyers asked for her cocoa specifically. The same market women who had once laughed at her suitcases now sent their daughters to ask whether the facility was hiring, and Chiamaka hired some of them, not out of forgiveness exactly, but because turning away a woman's daughter for her mother's old cruelty had never once been the kind of person she intended to become. While her name grew quietly across the trade, the Adesanya real estate empire, never as solid as its reputation suggested, collapsed under the weight of the very lone Chief Mrs. Adesanya had once valued over her own son's marriage. 2 unfinished projects, an associate who withdrew his backing over an unrelated dispute, and 2 generations of careful appearances came apart within 18 months. Obinna, who had never once needed to learn what discipline cost, found himself in his early 40s starting over with considerably less skill at it than the woman his family had discarded for lacking the right blood. The position that brought Obinna to Chiamaka's processing facility was, by any honest account, simple desperation rather than any deliberate search. A labor recruiter in town mentioning that a respected export operation outside Akure was hiring additional hands for the coming harvest season, work that required no particular pedigree, only a willingness to do it properly. He arrived on a Tuesday morning in clothes that had clearly once been considerably finer than what circumstance now required of him, and stood at the edge of the processing yard for a long moment before he recognized, with a shock that visibly moved through his entire body, exactly whose name was painted across the storage building in front of him. Chiamaka, walking the yard with her morning inspection, as she did every day regardless of who happened to be standing in it, saw him before he fully composed himself to approach her. Obinna's hands were not steady as he spoke, and for a man who had once moved through every room with the unearned ease of someone whose name had always opened doors for him, the unsteadiness itself said more than his words did. He explained, with considerably less pride than the young man who had once asked her to marry him against his entire family's wishes, exactly how thoroughly the business had collapsed, how he had spent the better part of 2 years discovering precisely how little his family's old name actually meant, once the money behind it had quietly disappeared. He told her, his voice breaking somewhere in the middle of the sentence, that he had thought about that locked gate more times than he could count, that he had told himself for years it had been his mother's decision and not his own, until the lie of that excuse finally became too heavy to keep carrying alone. Chiamaka listened to all of it, the way she now listened to every difficult negotiation, fully, without interrupting. When she finally spoke, her voice did not rise, though for the first time in years it carried something rawer underneath its calm. She told him she did not hate him, and had stopped carrying that particular weight years earlier, somewhere in the slow work of pruning trees that finally began bearing fruit again. But she also told him, plainly, that he should not mistake the absence of hatred for the absence of memory, that she still remembered exactly what it felt like to stand outside a gate with 2 packed suitcases and no one inside that house willing to open the door and ask her to stay. She had not expected Chief Mrs. Adesanya to come herself. And yet, 3 weeks later, an aging woman in a faded version of the elegant lace she had once worn so easily stood at the same gate Chiamaka now owned, asking the gateman, in a voice considerably smaller than the one Chiamaka remembered, whether Madam might have a few minutes to spare. She did not waste either of their time pretending the visit was about anything other than money. The family had nothing left, she explained, sitting stiffly in a chair across from the same farmer's daughter she had once refused to seat at her own dinner table, and Obinna's modest wages from the harvest work were not enough to cover the medical bills a recent illness had left behind. She did not apologize for the dessert table comment, or the malaria, or the visit she had cut short to 11 minutes, or the photograph she had quietly rearranged one Christmas so a more suitable woman could stand where Chiamaka once had. She simply asked, plainly, for help. The way a woman asks who has never once in her life needed to ask for anything before. Chiamaka looked at her for a long moment before she answered. She told her, calmly, that she remembered every single year of that house, the malaria she nursed herself through with a wet cloth and no doctor, the parents she had walked to the gate, apologizing with her eyes for a welcome they never received, the birthday garden, where 60 guests laughed at a joke made at her expense. She told her she forgave her, fully, because carrying that weight for another 16 years had never once been a punishment Folashade Adesanya would feel. Only one Chiamaka herself would have to keep lifting. But forgiveness, she said, was not the same thing as rescue, and she would not be writing a check to undo. Conveniently, the only consequence either of them had ever actually faced for 16 years of small, deliberate cruelty. Obinna asked, separately, whether there might be a place for him beyond the seasonal harvest work, acknowledging, even as he asked, that he understood exactly how complicated the question was coming from him specifically. Chiamaka told him there was honest work available to anyone willing to do it on the same terms as everyone else on the yard. No different treatment, no shortcut, through the years of unglamorous labor that had built everything around them. Handing him an easier path than the one she herself had walked would mean repeating the exact mistake his own mother had once made, deciding someone's worth by their name rather than what they had actually proven themselves capable of building. She made certain, before either of them could mistake her forgiveness for an invitation back into anything, that they understood precisely where the door she had opened actually led, and where it did not. The same market women who had once laughed at her suitcases now greeted her when she visited the old stalls with a respect that had clearly cost them something to offer honestly. None of them apologized directly. A few simply began addressing her, for the first time since she'd come home with nothing, by her full name and title, a small correction that meant more to her than any formal apology might have. In the village, the story eventually settled into a different shape entirely, told now not with pity or mockery, but with something closer to quiet astonishment, that the woman once thrown out for having the wrong blood had built, with her own two patient hands. Something an entire wealthy family with all the right blood in the world had not managed to hold on to. Chiamaka's export operation continued to grow in the years that followed. The trees around her father's old plot, now stretching across a property considerably larger than the 6 struggling hectares she had once walked in despair beside a father who feared he had nothing left to give her. She never remarried, feeling no particular urgency about it, having learned, across 16 difficult years, that a life built entirely on her own patient labor required no one else's name and no one else's forgiveness to feel complete. Some families spend 2 generations building a name, only to discover how little it was ever actually worth once the money behind it disappears. But some women, given enough time, enough patience, and the smallest piece of stubborn land, build something no single act of cruelty or an entire village's laughter can ever take from them a second time. If you stayed with this story until the end, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe so you don't miss the next one.